In this lesson, we're going to take a look at sessions. So what we're going to do is just walk through a few of the different things we can do with sessions, and that's going to come from the City Manager Web Sessions WAR. Just remember, import this and rename your project back to City Manager Web so that all the pages work as expected. We will have quite a few redirects in this, so it's very important. So what we're going to get with this is a few new pages. We're going to get a login page that will allow us to simulate a user login. We're going to have a user login servlet, which will allow us to do some stuff with sessions. We're going to have an invalidate session. We're going to have an authorized servlet that will allow us to see some differences with sessions. And then we're going to have a destination page, which will be our landing page that we're trying to get an authorized user to. Let's start by looking at our login page here. Let's go ahead and expand this. This is just a simple form with a username and password that allows us to log in and simulate that, and we'll redirect to the user login servlet. When we hit the user login servlet, we're going to simulate that we've basically made some checks on the database and that username password actually was valid. So we'll set the user ID and the auth level from the information we returned from the database, and we'll just use that auth level as the variable that determines whether or not we're authorized. So anything greater than 0, we're going to be authorized. So we'll just assume it's valid. We could then redirect to any pages or servlets we want. But what we want to do is we want to start working with the session so that we don't have to keep checking the database every time. So we're going to set the user attributes into the database, and then we can just validate that on pages where it needs to be authorized. And that helps us if we especially have multiple user level authorization where not everybody's authorized to see everything or certain levels. Instead of pulling from the database every time, we could simply check this attribute and see where they're at, if they're authorized or not. So we need to grab the HTTP session. So in order to do that, you create a variable on the HTTP session. We'll just name it S here. You can name it whatever you want, of course. And we need to import javix.servlet.http session. And we pull directly off the request.get session. Now that allows us to access the session. And once we have that, just like our other things that we've seen where we had the request attributes, we can simply use the session attributes. So here we're going to do s.setAttribute. And we're going to basically put a username and a user auth level in place. You can see then that we can have objects. It doesn't have to be just a string. Again, since it's an attribute, which gives us a little more power. We can pass a string around as the user ID and an integer for the auth level. If you had more complex objects you wanted to pass around, of course, you could do that. Once you've set them, of course, what we want to do is then redirect our user to whatever page they want to go to. So here we're going to simulate that we have destination page.do as the valid URL. Of course, you could have that as a request parameter, or you could have that as a request attribute somehow passed into this servlet that lets us know where the user was trying to go when they logged in. And you might be saying, this is silly. Why would we need to have this every time? What happens is if we're doing some session attributes that we're going to try to validate, we want to make sure that every time we hit any page that needs to be protected, we have the ability to validate that the user is authorized. And so what we can do then is just have a common landing page to do that for this sample. Now what we'll see later when we get into filters is that there's actually a better way to do that, of course, using a filter, which would then automatically be checked for that authorization rather than us having to write and redirect through 3 different servlets each time. Let's go ahead and look at our login here and watch that work so that we can see that, of course, when we log in, it will set into our session. And so we don't have anything that we really are going to log in, so you could just type whatever you want here. And we'll just, again, be simulating that that was a valid login, which will then take us to the destination page, which says, Welcome Authorized User. Well, what did it do? Well, the destination page simply went out and grabbed the session that we've already created and checked if the session is not null, the session is not new. Is new is a way that we can check if the session is brand new or if it has already been created. And we have an attribute we want to make sure is not null, which is username. So if the username has already been set into session, so the session is no longer new and the session is not null, then we can pull that user ID back and then we can print that out and we can say welcome authorized user. However, if it isn't valid, we could then simply say unauthorized. And so what we'll see is that as we work with our sessions here in our Eclipse IDE, sometimes even across server restarts, the session's not reset. And so what we can do is actually learn next about invalidate session. So invalidate session is just a simple call on the session object itself. So we get the same session object that we got before, and we just call to s.invalidate. And that allows us to invalidate the session and thereby clear out all the variables. Of course, this would only be used if you want to wipe everything out of session, because you don't want to use this if you need to keep certain things in session, because this wipes out the entire session. You have to start new again. So let's see the invalidate session in place. So we'll go ahead and just simply type invalidate session.do. Now that will go ahead and invalidate it, tell us that we need to log in again, and we can prove that it worked by going back to destination page.do, and that will then say you are unauthorized. So we're no longer the authorized user. So we've seen if we log in, we go through the user login, and then we went to destination page. But the last thing we want to look at is what happens if someone tries to hit a page that we're protecting. So for instance, authorized.do. So this would be some page that we need to have a login credential in order to use. What we can do is redirect them back to login. Well, how did that work? Same thing that we've seen already. We're going to go ahead and request our session directly from the request. And then we're just going to use a few variables to check things, and we can determine attributes and see if they're there. Again, if they're not null, we can pull them, and we can ultimately determine how we want to validate that user. Once they're authorized, we can go ahead and send them on to the destination page. Otherwise, we can send them back to the login. And so what you can see here is if you go ahead and log in, we're on the user login page here. If you go ahead and just log in with whatever, you'll be set in session. And that says that we are, in fact, set in session. And then we can go back to our authorized page, and it will thereby say, yes, you are valid. Go ahead and go on to the page you were really trying to go to. So once again, that authorized page is kind of an intermediary step that we'll hopefully learn how to replace with filters later on as we grow. But for now, it's just a good way for us to see how we could use those session variables in play.